Okay. So, U.S. involvement in the war. All right, here we go. Neutrality. The U.S. is going to remain isolated and vow not to get involved. This ought to sound real familiar. This is what we talked about during World War I. We vowed not to get involved. But behind the scenes, Roosevelt was talking with Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, to come up with ways we could help the Allies while staying neutral. There were several acts taken by Roosevelt to try to move us toward a more active involvement, where we could maintain neutrality but help our friends. The first thing that Roosevelt did, destroyers for bases. The United States gave Great Britain 50 destroyers or warships, in return for the use of British naval bases. In what became known as Lend-Lease, the United States would lend or lease supplies and equipment to any country considered vital to the defense of the United States. This is kind of like the equivalent of a garden hose. A neighbor asking to borrow a garden hose. And what you would do is you say, sure, you can borrow my hose, and when you're done with it, please give it back. So the United States would lend money and machines for war to the Allies, namely Great Britain. In exchange, England would give them back after the war was over. Okay? Roosevelt discussed his four freedoms speech of speech, religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear became the basis for Roosevelt and Churchill's new alliance. And they codified these in what becomes known as the Atlantic Charter, where Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to bring the four freedoms to everyone. 26 nations signed on to the Atlantic Charter and became part of the Allies, or the good guys. Good guys in World War II are called the Allies. The Axis powers are the bad guys. We also give help to China, aid to China, okay, in their struggle against the Japanese, the militaristic Japanese who had invaded Manchuria. We agree to help them. And we enact a trade embargo against the Japanese. So all these things, folks, yeah, we may be neutral, officially be neutral, but these don't sound like the acts of a neutral nation, do they? Very obviously, we are taking sides here. We are on the sides of the Allies. We are on the sides of England, okay? The good guys. Okay? So we are actively working to hurt the Axis powers' war efforts here and help our friends. Okay. So, of course, the event that got us into World War II, hopefully every one of you all know what that was. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. December the 8th, 1941, the U.S. declared war on Japan. Roosevelt got on the radio and addressed the American people, and he said, "Yesterday, the Empire of Japan maliciously attacked the United States of America at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii." He called December the 7th, 1941, a date which would live in infamy. And this is the event that plunges us into World War II. We declared war on Japan, and once we declared war on Japan, Germany, who was Japan's ally, declared war on us. So the United States gets pulled into World War II, even though we tried to maintain our neutrality. All right? So the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, is what pulls us officially into the war. Okay? Y'all follow me here? You good? Excellent. Okay. In terms of the effects of World War II on American society, Franklin Roosevelt called on the American people to become an arsenal of democracy, where American industry switched over to war production. The biggest thing the U.S. brings to the table is seemingly unlimited production of all kinds of goods, war and consumer. Ford Motor Company, GM, they stopped building cars and start building planes and tanks. Okay? Even the Walt Disney Studios shut down and started making propaganda for the war effort. Remember, I told you guys that as much as Roosevelt's New Deal made us feel good about ourselves, it would be World War II which would pull us out of the Great Depression. Unemployment nearly evaporates during World War II. And there were more jobs than there were people to fill those jobs during World War II. Everybody goes back to work. You had an increase in wages. Labor receives the benefits of war production. Right? You also had rationing, where there were efforts made to conserve certain products like gasoline, oil, sugar, coffee, shoes, nylons, which are like pantyhose, meat, and rubber. You were given coupon books, rationing coupon books. Okay? And you were only allowed to buy so much of these products per week. And once your ration coupon was gone, you weren't supposed to get any more. Right? Now, you could trade for things. My grandmother did not smoke, but she had a lot of friends who did. So she would go ahead and get her ration of cigarettes and trade it for other things her friends had, that she could use. So there was kind of a science involved in all this. All right? Now, the transition, folks, from World War I to World War II in terms of just how much government Americans were willing to tolerate in their life, think about how much the New Deal has altered that. Where you had the most involvement of the federal government in your life was the mailman prior to the New Deal. Now you've got people submitting to rationing and coupons from the federal government, limiting you to how much commodity you could buy. That shows you just how much the American people have evolved here in just 20 years. Here's a rationing line for sugar during World War II. You had to use that rationing coupon in order to be able to buy it. If you'd already used it, you couldn't go back for any more. All right? In terms of the effects of World War II on American society, Executive Order 8802 outlawed discrimination in the federal government and defense jobs. African Americans, this is the third big wave of African Americans out of the South and to the North. The first one came after the Civil War, the Exodusters. Remember Pat Singleton from Tennessee we talked about? The second one was after World War I, during World War I, when African Americans moved north to find work in factories in World War I. And the third big wave was during World War II, where African Americans leave the South and move to the North to work in factories. The Bracero program, the United States brought in 2 million migrant Mexican workers while we had soldiers overseas fighting. Mexican workers were brought in to help produce in the fields. Okay. There was also a draft. We had one in World War I. We've got one in World War II. 10 million Americans were drafted, and another 5 million volunteered to serve. 15 million men in uniform, and another 350,000 women who helped behind the scenes ultimately would serve in World War II. Okay. Women in America served in non-combat roles. They were part of the Army, where they were known as the WWIIs. The Waves were in the Navy. The Spars were in the Coast Guard. And you also had the Women's Air Force Service. These were all areas where women participated. Now, in the Soviet Union, women actually served in the Red Army. They were actually part of combat. But women were never part of active combat in World War II for America. They were behind the scenes. But in Russia, in Red Russia, women actually fought in the Red Army. Rosie the Riveter was propaganda. We can do it. I'm sure you all have seen that, like you see on the bottom right there, that propaganda poster. While men were fighting, women went to work in factories and started cranking out the tanks and the planes and the jeeps and the ships and the submarines and everything else. Okay? A lot of women discovered they liked going to work. They liked getting up and going to work every day and making money. So, unlike World War I, where many women went back into the home, a lot of women decided they enjoyed working and would decide to stay in the workforce after World War II. But Rosie the Riveter was propaganda designed to encourage women to participate in the war effort. African Americans actively served in our military in World War II. Over 1 million served, in fact, in combat roles. Okay? The Tuskegee Airmen were very, very famous, very decorated African American servicemen. People, in order to raise money for the war, bought war bonds. There were new taxes that were implemented to raise money for the war effort. The war bonds were like making loans to the government. You bought a war bond. You're like, I'd like $20 worth of war bonds. And they would give you your $20 worth of war bonds. And several years after the war would be over, you could go and cash that bond in and get a little interest for your loan to the government. So you could do two things. You could be patriotic, and ultimately after the war was over, you could make money for being patriotic. Now, one of the most shameful things in all of American history was Executive Order 9066. Now, I think in Star Wars, there's like an executive order. The Emperor's like Execute Order 66. Okay, that's named after this. Okay, and Executive Order 9066 rounds up Japanese Americans and placed them in essentially concentration camps on the West Coast in states like California, Oregon, and Washington, where they were detained simply because they were Japanese background. Like these are American citizens, folks, rounding up. So just throw the Constitution out the window. And the Supreme Court, Korematsu versus the United States. This is an easy one to remember because see the name, Korematsu, that's a Japanese name. You can remember that court case because of the name of the case. The Supreme Court said it was okay. The Supreme Court, in an epic fail, ruled that it was, during a time of war, okay to round up Japanese American citizens in the name of safety. All right? That's unbelievable. So, Executive Order 9066 is what rounded up Japanese Americans and put them in concentration camps. And Korematsu versus the United States basically said it was okay. The 442 Infantry Regiment was an all-Japanese regiment in the U.S. Army during World War II. This was the only way for Japanese American males to get out of camps. They weren't allowed to serve in Japan out of fear that they would be spied. So the Japanese American 442nd Infantry served in the European theater. They had to go and fight the Germans. All right. The Code Talkers, real famous movie. Nicolas Cage is in, called Code Talkers or the Wind Talkers or something, where Native Americans from the Navajo tribe were used in the Pacific Theater as messengers because their language was unknown to the Japanese. They put those Indians on the radio, and the Japanese were like, what in the world language is this? They could never crack the code. They could never crack the Navajo code from what it was. They cracked some other codes, but the Japanese and the Germans never did figure out the Navajo language, what that was, which is so cool. Okay. In terms of Tennessee's contribution to World War II, there were a lot of them, guys. These are very important. The state loves Tennessee history on these exams, so you need to make sure you're paying attention here. Camp Campbell was home to the 101st Airborne Division. That's over in Middle Tennessee, right below Kentucky. Okay, just below Kentucky. Fort Campbell, Camp Campbell. Camp Forrest is over in West Tennessee and was the largest armor training school and largest POW camp in the U.S. until it closed after the war. There were a lot of German POWs that got sent to Camp Forrest. And after the war was over, they were let go. A lot of them just decided to stay here. They're like, well, it sucks in Germany. We like it much better here. So a lot of them just decided to stay after the war was over. Like, there's nothing to go home to. Germany had been bombed back to the Stone Age. Alcoa. Some of you guys may have family that work out at Alcoa. They made aluminum, the biggest producer of aluminum in the United States. And of course, that was used for all kinds of planes and tanks and everything else. Right? Kingsport is home to Eastman Chemical Company. During games at Neyland Stadium, you'd hear Bobby Denton go, "Fans, notice the big receptacles as you leave today, and please recycle because volunteers, good sports, always recycle." Eastman Chemical Company made chemicals for the war effort, and explosives. Okay, big producer of explosives. Still make them today. Chattanooga made explosives. Memphis provided storage and shipping for the Southeast and the Midwest. And of course, you guys know probably what the Manhattan Project was. Oak Ridge was the secret city. That is where the atomic bomb was developed. Y'all knew that, right? The Manhattan Project was the code name for the development of the atomic bomb. Oak Ridge was created as a secret city specifically for this purpose, for working on the atomic bomb in World War II. So the Manhattan Project was the secret code name for development of the atomic bomb in World War II. Okay? Cordell Hull was a former member of the House of Representatives from Middle Tennessee. He was our Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt and was a big organizer of the United Nations who would win the Nobel Prize for his work with the UN in 1945. So guys, all these things, they love Tennessee history. And there's almost always something on the state test about or Tennessee's involvement in World War II. It could be any one of those things. Okay? So, American propaganda, there was all kinds of it to help the war effort. Here you see, it says, "I'm proud my husband wants me to do my part." Here's a piece of propaganda. "Open trap, make happy Jap." See the Japanese guy who's supposed to look like Hirohito listening through the keyhole? They're trying to be careful. Be careful who you're talking to. "Women in the war, we can't win without them. Keep this horror from your home. Invest 10% of your income in war bonds. Back up our battle skies." Now, these have shown up before on the state test. Dr. Seuss, as in the Dr. Seuss, also drew propaganda cartoons for World War II. Look at this over here. This little guy says, me, I'd give my life for my country. But you see these little cats down here that say, yeah, but 10% of his income for war bonds. That's a different matter. So it's like, yeah, don't be a big talker. Get out there and buy war bonds. Over here it says, don't let them carve those faces on our mountains. Look, there's Hitler and Hirohito. And it's trying to show what could happen if they win. So it says, buy United States saving bonds and stamps. Okay? Here is Hirohito sitting down in a hot bath that says war with the United States. So he's sitting down in that hot bath. He's going to burn his rear end because he's picked a fight with America. And we haven't gotten there to the outbreak of the attack on the Soviet Union yet. But look at all these heads. All these heads on Hitler's wall represent countries Hitler has invaded. Okay? And now he's caught. Can anybody see what that bear says right there? Russia. It doesn't look like that one's going to be as easy to kill and put up on his wall, is it? So all this is propaganda. Dr. Seuss did this, and some of these cartoons by Dr. Seuss have shown up before on the state test. Here's more propaganda, the Fuhrer's face, victory through air power, all kinds of stuff. Okay, go ahead and submit those notes for me, please.